The mansion stood tall and proud against the skyline, its marble walls gleaming under the fading sun, but inside it felt cold, like a museum filled with expensive things no one wanted to touch. For Alexander Carter, the wealthiest man in the city, every step he took echoed through the empty halls, a cruel reminder of the silence that had replaced laughter. His late wife, Charlotte, had once filled this place with warmth, turning the cavernous rooms into a home. But since her sudden death, the house felt more like a mausoleum than a haven. His twins, Ethan and Emma, were only 3 years old, too young to truly understand the permanence of loss, yet old enough to sense the shift. They cried for their mother at night, clutching pillows that no longer carried her scent. Alexander tried, he really did, but grief wrapped around him like chains, leaving him helpless and clumsy in fatherhood. He didn't know how to soothe nightmares or braid his daughter's hair. He could buy them toys, clothes, anything they wanted, but he couldn't give them the one thing they needed most, love freely given without hesitation. The previous nannies hadn't lasted. One stayed only a week, declaring the twins too much trouble. Another, despite her polished resume, treated them like chores, feeding them by the clock and ignoring their cries when they reached out for affection. Alexander dismissed her on the spot the day Emma sobbed uncontrollably and the nanny shrugged as if it didn't matter. He wanted someone who would treat his children as children, not as tasks. It was on one particularly rainy afternoon, when the sky matched the heaviness in his heart, that Grace came into their lives. She didn't arrive with flashy credentials or an air of superiority like the others. She walked into the interview in a modest dress, her hair neatly tied back, her hands folded nervously in her lap. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance, but her eyes, they were calm, steady, and kind. Alexander had barely looked up from his papers when she entered, his voice brisk and rehearsed. "You know the requirements. 2 children, both energetic, sometimes difficult. The schedule is demanding. I need someone who won't quit." Grace didn't flinch. "Children aren't difficult, Mr. Carter. They're just honest. They show you what they feel, even when adults are too proud to do the same." For the first time in weeks, Alexander looked up fully, meeting her gaze. Her words were simple, but they struck something inside him. He almost dismissed her out of habit. She seemed too gentle, too unassuming, but something in him hesitated. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the faint spark of hope he'd buried, but he gave her the chance. The very next morning, Grace stepped into the mansion not as an applicant but as the twins' nanny. She didn't waste time with formalities. She knelt to their level, smiled, and introduced herself. "I'm Grace. I'm here to play, to help, and to listen." Ethan's usual shyness cracked into curiosity, while Emma reached out to touch Grace's hair with innocent boldness. By the end of the first hour, laughter rang through the halls, real laughter, not the hollow echoes Alexander had grown used to. He paused outside the playroom, listening to his children giggle as Grace stacked blocks into crooked towers, pretending each collapse was a disaster that needed heroic saving. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own house. But Alexander remained guarded. He kept his interactions with Grace professional, distant. He told himself she was just another employee. When she smiled at him politely in the mornings, he answered with curt nods. When she tried to make small talk, he diverted the conversation back to the children. It wasn't that he disliked her. On the contrary, he found her presence oddly comforting. But his heart was still stitched with grief, and he was terrified of loosening the threads. Grace seemed to understand without him saying a word. She didn't push, didn't pry. Instead, she poured her energy into the twins. She read them bedtime stories in soft voices, even when she was tired. She sang lullabies that made Emma's eyelids flutter shut. She chased Ethan across the gardens until his laughter echoed against the stone walls. Slowly, the children began to bloom again, their faces glowing with the kind of joy Alexander thought he'd buried alongside his wife. One evening, as Alexander returned from work later than usual, he found the kitchen alive with a smell he hadn't encountered in years, home-cooked food. Grace stood by the stove, her sleeves rolled up, humming softly as she stirred a pot. The twins sat on the counter, their cheeks smudged with flour, proudly holding wooden spoons. Alexander cleared his throat, startled by the scene. "What's going on here?" Grace glanced up, a teasing smile tugging at her lips. "We're making dinner. Or at least, we're trying." Ethan waved his spoon. "Daddy, we helped. We're chefs now." For a brief second, Alexander almost smiled. Almost. He masked it quickly, but the warmth lingered longer than he expected. He sat at the table later, eating the simple pasta Grace had prepared, and realized it was the first meal in months that didn't taste like emptiness. Days turned into weeks, and Grace's presence became woven into their routine. The twins clung to her like vines to sunlight, and Alexander, though he wouldn't admit it aloud, began to look forward to the sound of her voice echoing through the halls. He often found himself pausing mid-task just to listen to her laughter with the children. Still, he battled with himself. He shouldn't, let anyone close. His love had belonged to Charlotte, and opening his heart again felt like betrayal. But grief has strange ways of softening when it meets kindness, and though Alexander didn't realize it, the walls he'd built so carefully were beginning to show cracks. On a quiet night, long after the twins had gone to bed, Alexander found himself standing by the window in his study, staring at the city lights. He thought about Grace's words during the interview, how children were simply honest. He envied that honesty. His twins cried when they hurt, laughed when they were happy, clung to Grace when they needed comfort. He, on the other hand, hid behind silence, behind his wealth, behind walls that kept everyone at a distance. As the clock ticked into midnight, a sound broke his thoughts, a soft melody floating through the halls. Curious, he followed it and found Grace in the nursery, humming to Emma, who had woken from a nightmare. Grace's hand stroked the little girl's hair, her voice a gentle balm. Emma's sobs quieted, her body relaxing against Grace's chest. Alexander stood in the doorway, unseen. A lump formed in his throat as he watched. He realized then that his children weren't just surviving, they were healing. And it was because of Grace. The morning began like any other, sunlight spilling over the manicured lawns of the Carter estate, the twins chasing each other through the halls while Grace tried to coax them into their clothes. Alexander left early for a meeting, his mind consumed with numbers and negotiations, leaving the mansion in its usual rhythm of laughter and soft discipline. But fate had a way of bending ordinary days into something unforgettable, and that afternoon would leave an impression on Alexander that no amount of wealth could ever erase. The meeting had ended sooner than expected, leaving him restless. He considered heading to his office downtown, but something tugged at him, an inexplicable pull toward home. He dismissed it as exhaustion and ordered the driver back to the mansion. When they arrived, he stepped out of the car, loosened his tie, and decided to walk through the gardens before going inside. The air was thick with the scent of fresh grass, the kind of simple fragrance that reminded him of childhood before life had grown complicated. He had almost forgotten what peace smelled like. Then he heard it, laughter. Not polite chuckles or forced amusement, but the full-bodied, bubbling laughter of children. It came from beyond the oak trees near the side of the property. He frowned. That part of the garden was rarely used. Curious, he followed the sound, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path. When he stepped past the trees, he froze. There, in the golden spill of afternoon sunlight, was Grace. She had rolled up her sleeves, her dress hem slightly damp, and beside her stood a wooden barrel filled with water. Ethan and Emma were inside, their hair wet and their cheeks glowing pink with joy. Grace was kneeling beside them, gently rinsing Emma's curls with a tin cup, while Ethan splashed water, sending droplets sparkling through the air like diamonds. The twins squealed with delight, their voices carrying over the breeze. Alexander's first thought was shock. Why on earth were his children bathing in a barrel, when inside the mansion there were half a dozen marble bathrooms with heated tubs? But the second thought came swiftly, silencing the first. His children were happy. Genuinely, radiantly happy. Their giggles rang with a purity he hadn't heard since Charlotte's death. And Grace, she wasn't just washing them. She was making it an adventure, a game, turning a mundane act into a moment of magic. His chest tightened. For months, he had buried himself in grief and work, believing joy was something his children would have to wait years to rediscover. Yet here it was, right in front of him, in the simplest of scenes. Grace wasn't giving them luxury, she was giving them love. And somehow, that mattered more than every dollar he had ever earned. He didn't step forward. He didn't want to intrude on their world. Instead, he stood half-hidden behind the tree, watching as if he were witnessing something sacred. Grace laughed as Emma splashed her back, her hair damp from the spray, yet she didn't scold or sigh in frustration. She laughed with them, her voice blending seamlessly with theirs. Alexander realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard such a sound, pure, unguarded laughter. When the children were finally lifted from the barrel, wrapped in soft towels Grace had brought with her, they clung to her with sleepy smiles. She kissed their damp foreheads as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Alexander's throat tightened at the sight. He should be the one doing that. He was their father. Yet here she was, giving them something he couldn't bring himself to give. He walked back to the house in silence, his footsteps heavy. That image of Grace with his twins followed him into the study, refusing to leave. He sat behind his desk, staring at contracts he couldn't read, his mind replaying the scene like a reel. He tried to dismiss it as sentimentality, but the truth was harder to ignore. He had felt something stir inside him. Something dangerously close to hope. At dinner that night, the twins chattered endlessly about their barrel bath. Ethan mimicked the splashes, while Emma giggled, retelling how Grace had pretended to be a sea captain rescuing them from stormy waters. Alexander listened quietly, his fork untouched, his eyes drawn again and again to Grace. She didn't boast about what she had done. She simply smiled at the children's retelling, her gaze dropping shyly whenever she caught Alexander watching her. Later, after the twins had been tucked into bed, Alexander found himself wandering to the kitchen where Grace was tidying up. She hummed softly as she wiped the counters, her movements unhurried, graceful. He cleared his throat, and she turned, startled. "You bathed them in a barrel today," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. Grace straightened, her brow knitting slightly. "Yes. The weather was warm, and they wanted to play outside. It was harmless fun. They have bathrooms," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Her eyes softened, but her answer was firm. "Yes, but sometimes children don't need marble and gold. They need laughter. They need memories they'll hold onto when they're older. Happiness doesn't always live in expensive places, Mr. Carter." The words struck him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue but found none came. Instead, he watched her quietly, the steady strength in her gaze both humbling and unsettling. For the first time in a long time, someone had challenged him, not with arrogance, but with truth. That night, lying in his vast, empty bed, Alexander couldn't shake her words. Happiness doesn't always live in expensive places. He had spent years building wealth, surrounding himself with luxury, and yet his children's joy had bloomed in a wooden barrel under the open sky. He wondered if he had been blind all along, mistaking material comfort for love. Days passed, but the image of the barrel bath stayed with him. He noticed more of Grace's small acts, the way she knelt to tie Ethan's shoes, how she braided Emma's hair with ribbons she bought herself, how she sang while folding their clothes. She didn't treat her work as duty, she treated it as devotion. And slowly, Alexander began to realize that what he had witnessed that day was not an exception. It was who Grace was. The walls around his heart, once so impenetrable, had begun to weaken. He found himself pausing outside the playroom, listening to the sound of Grace reading stories in animated voices. He caught himself smiling when he overheard the twins begging her for just one more story. And when he sat down at meals, he realized the food tasted better simply because she had prepared it with care. One evening, he returned from work to find the twins asleep on the couch, curled against Grace's arms as she read silently from a book. The sight stopped him in his tracks. The children looked safe, loved, as if they belonged there. As if she belonged there. The days began to stretch into a rhythm that Alexander hadn't realized he needed. He still woke early, still dressed in his pressed suits, still conducted his business with the same sharp mind that had built his empire, but now there was something different waiting for him when he returned home. It wasn't the silence of the marble halls anymore, it was the sound of voices, laughter, and warmth. Grace had turned the mansion into something that no interior designer or fortune could buy. She had turned it back into a home. Alexander had always thought he knew what strength looked like. In his world, strength was about closing deals, managing risks, keeping emotions out of decisions. But as he watched Grace from a distance, he realized there was another kind of strength, one that was quieter, humbler, but infinitely more powerful. It was in the way she never grew impatient with Ethan's endless questions or Emma's stubborn moods. It was in how she treated the children as little people with feelings that mattered, not as burdens or tasks. She carried her strength not with noise, but with patience, and it humbled him. One morning, as he prepared to leave for the office, Ethan came. Running down the hall, his small hands clutching a piece of paper. "Daddy, look." His cheeks were flushed with excitement as he thrust the crayon drawing into Alexander's hand. Alexander glanced down. It was a picture of 4 figures, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and 2 smaller stick figures holding hands. Above it, in uneven, wobbly letters. Ethan had scrawled, "My family." For a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. His son had drawn Grace as part of their family. The thought should have unsettled him, perhaps even angered him, but instead it filled his chest with a warmth he couldn't quite name. "Grace helped us color it," Ethan said proudly, before darting back toward the kitchen where Emma's laughter echoed. Alexander stood there, staring at the picture long after his children had gone. Something in him shifted again, a piece of the wall around his heart crumbling further. That evening, over dinner, he found himself watching Grace more than he should have. The way her eyes crinkled when Emma told a joke, the way she leaned forward to listen as though every word from the children mattered. When her gaze accidentally met his across the table, he looked away too quickly, pretending to be absorbed in his wine. But the heat that lingered in his chest betrayed him. It was around this time that the twins began repeating things Grace told them, sprinkling her words into their innocent conversations. One night, as Alexander tucked Ethan into bed, a habit he was slowly learning to reclaim, his son asked softly, "Daddy, is it true that love isn't about money?" Alexander froze, the question catching him off guard. "Why do you ask that?" "Grace said so. She said love is about time and hugs and listening." Ethan's small face was full of sincerity. "Is that true?" For once, Alexander didn't have an immediate answer. The man who always had solutions, always had strategies, sat there at a loss. He swallowed, his voice lower than usual. "Yes, Ethan, that's true." As he left the room that night, he realized how much of Grace had already woven itself into his children's lives. She was teaching them lessons he hadn't even thought to give. And deep down, he knew she was teaching him too. In the days that followed, he started spending more time at home, finding excuses to cut meetings short or reschedule appointments. He told himself it was for the children, but he knew better. He wanted to be near Grace, to see the way she moved through the house with effortless grace, to hear the sound of her laughter drifting down the halls. Sometimes, he lingered in the doorway of the playroom, pretending to check on the twins, when in reality his eyes followed the nanny who had somehow stolen his attention. Other times, he found himself in the kitchen late at night, just to see if she was there finishing up chores. Each time, he told himself it was coincidence, but deep down he knew it was not. One evening, he returned home earlier than usual to find Grace sitting on the floor with the twins, surrounded by a circle of books. She was reading aloud, her voice animated, her hands gesturing wildly as Ethan and Emma shrieked with laughter. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, unnoticed, watching the scene. It struck him then that he had never seen his children so free, so alive. Grace hadn't just given them care, she had given them back their childhood. After the twins fell asleep that night, he lingered in the nursery, reluctant to leave. Grace was still there, adjusting Emma's blanket with tender precision. When she turned and saw him in the doorway, she started slightly. "I didn't mean to disturb," she whispered. "You didn't," he said quietly. "I was just watching." There was a pause, the air between them heavy but not uncomfortable. He wanted to say more, to thank her for what she was doing, to confess the strange storm building in his chest, but the words caught in his throat. She gave him a small smile and slipped past him, her perfume faint but lingering, leaving him rooted in place long after she had gone. The following days made it harder to keep his feelings hidden. He began noticing the smallest things about her, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way her eyes sparkled when she made the children laugh, the soft humming that accompanied her chores. These details etched themselves into his mind, uninvited but unforgettable. Grace, however, carried herself with the same composure as always. If she noticed his lingering glances, she didn't let on. She respected her role, never stepping beyond the boundaries of her position, though there was a quiet gentleness in her eyes whenever they met his. The tension grew unspoken, like a thread pulling tighter with each passing day. He found himself restless at night, pacing his study, replaying conversations in his mind, imagining words he couldn't yet bring himself to say. He was a man used to control, but this feeling, slipped through his fingers like water. One late afternoon, a storm rolled in, thunder cracking against the sky. The twins, frightened by the noise, clung to Grace as she held them close on the couch. Alexander entered the room just as a flash of lightning lit up the windows, and Emma whimpered. Without thinking, he crossed the room and sat beside them, his arm encircling his children, his gaze flicking briefly to Grace. Their eyes met in the dim light, and something passed between them, something silent yet undeniable. When the storm calmed and the twins finally drifted into sleep, Grace carefully laid them down and turned to leave. Alexander's hand twitched as if to reach for her, but he stopped himself. She gave him a soft nod, her expression unreadable, and walked away. He stayed there in the quiet, the echoes of